What's good, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into something that's been living rent-free in my head since I first played RDR2. How Rockstar basically took some of the most notorious real-life outlaw gangs from the Wild West and said, yeah, let's make this into the most emotionally devastating video game ever created. First up, let's talk about the Jesse James gang, because honestly, the parallels are kind of insane. Jesse James was basically the Dutch van der Linde of Missouri back in the day. His gang was robbing trains and banks left and right from the late 1860s through the early 1880s, and just like Dutch, Jesse had this whole Robin Hood complex going on. He genuinely believed he was fighting against corrupt corporations and the government, especially after the Civil War messed up the South. Sound familiar? That's literally Dutch's entire philosophy. This idea that they're fighting against civilization and modernization that's destroying the free way of life. The Jesse James gang was also super tight-knit, just like the van der Linde crew. It wasn't just random criminals thrown together. These were brothers, cousins, and close friends who'd die for each other. Frank James was Jesse's literal brother, and they had the younger brothers Cole, Jim, John, and Bob riding with them. The loyalty was real, but so was the paranoia. Jesse was constantly looking over his shoulder, worried about betrayal, and spoiler alert, he eventually got shot in the back by someone he trusted. If that doesn't give you Arthur and Dutch vibes, I don't know what will. Also, the Dalton gang, because these guys were absolutely unhinged, and their story is wild. The Daltons were basically the definition of go big or go home. They tried to rob two banks at the same time in the same town. In 1892, they rolled into Coffeyville, Kansas, and attempted to hit both the First National Bank and the Condon Bank simultaneously. It was supposed to be their big score, their final job before retiring to South America. Does this sound like a certain bank job in St. Denis? Because it should. The Coffeyville raid was a complete disaster, just like most of the van der Linde gang's later jobs. The townspeople recognized the Daltons despite their disguises, armed themselves, and turned the whole thing into a shootout. 4 out of 5 Dalton brothers died that day, along with 4 innocent townspeople. It's giving major, everything falls apart in the end, energy that RDR2 captures so perfectly. The Daltons thought they were untouchable, but reality hit them hard, just like it eventually hits Dutch's crew. Speaking of reality checks, let's talk about Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch because they're probably the closest real-life equivalent to the van der Linde gang's vibe. Butch Cassidy, whose real name was Robert Leroy Parker, led what was probably the most famous outlaw gang in American history. The Wild Bunch operated from the 1890s into the early 1900s, which is exactly when RDR2 takes place. They were known for their elaborate train and bank robberies, but also for being surprisingly non-violent compared to other gangs. They tried to avoid killing people when possible. But what's interesting, Dutch van der Linde's entire personality and leadership style is basically Butch Cassidy with a philosophy degree. Butch was known for being incredibly charismatic and well-spoken, almost like an educated gentleman who just happened to rob trains for a living. He could walk into a room and instantly command respect, not through intimidation, but through pure charm and intelligence. Sound familiar? That's literally Dutch's whole thing. He's this smooth-talking, well-read leader who quotes philosophy and makes grand speeches about freedom and civilization. Butch Cassidy was also famous for his ability to plan elaborate heists while keeping his gang together through sheer force of personality. He wasn't the best gunfighter in the Wild Bunch. That would be the Sundance Kid. But he was the unquestioned leader because people genuinely believed in his vision. He had this way of making even the most dangerous, morally questionable jobs sound like noble crusades for justice. Dutch does the exact same thing. He's constantly reframing their crimes as acts of rebellion against a corrupt system, making the gang feel like they're freedom fighters instead of just criminals. The Wild Bunch had this whole thing about being gentlemen outlaws, and they were weirdly respectful to their victims. They'd rob you blind but say please and thank you while doing it. This is so Arthur Morgan coded it's not even funny. But it was Butch who set that tone. He believed in a code of honor, even while breaking the law. Dutch has that same philosophical approach to outlawry, always talking about having standards and principles, even when they're literally robbing people. Both Butch and Dutch dealt with pressure and paranoia. As law enforcement closed in and their world got smaller, Butch became increasingly desperate and erratic, making riskier decisions that put his gang in danger. He started doubting his own judgment and became obsessed with one more big score that would solve all their problems. That's Dutch's entire character arc in RDR2. The confident, charismatic leader slowly unraveling as the walls close in, making increasingly desperate choices that destroy everything he claims to be fighting for. They also had multiple hideouts, including the famous Hole in the Wall in Wyoming, which was basically their version of camp. It was this remote, defensible location where they could lay low between jobs, plan their next moves, and just exist as a family of sorts. As law enforcement got more organized and technology advanced, they had to evolve their tactics. But eventually, the writing was on the wall. The Wild West was ending, and there was no place for outlaws in the modern world. Sound familiar? That's literally the entire theme of RDR2. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid famously fled to South America, just like Dutch and Micah do in the game's epilogue. The late 1800s and early 1900s were a time of massive technological and social change. Railroads were connecting the country, telegraph lines were enabling instant communication, and law enforcement was becoming more professional and coordinated. The romantic ideal of the free-spirited outlaw was becoming obsolete. The Jesse James gang fell apart because of betrayal and paranoia. The Dalton gang died because they got too greedy and overconfident. The Wild Bunch dissolved because the world moved on without them. And Dutch's gang? They hit all of these problems at once. The paranoia, the failed big scores, the inability to accept that their time was over. It's all there. Rockstar didn't just take inspiration from these gangs' crimes and adventures. They took the deeper themes and psychological elements that made these real people so compelling and tragic. The brotherhood, the loyalty, the gradual realization that they're fighting a losing battle against progress itself. That's why RDR2 hits so hard emotionally. It's not just about cowboys and gunfights. It's about the death of an entire way of life. And that's something that actually happened to real people. The Linde gang represents every outlaw gang that ever existed in the American West. Their hopes, their bonds, their inevitable downfall. Dutch's speeches about freedom and fighting against civilization echo things that Jesse James and Butch Cassidy actually said. Arthur's crisis of faith about their way of life mirrors the real doubts that gang members had as the world changed around them. But wait, there's one more thing we need to talk about that's absolutely crucial to understanding how real RDR2's world actually is: the Pinkertons. If you've played the game, you know these guys are basically the final boss of the entire story. They're the relentless, well-funded private investigators who hunt down the Linde gang with military precision. And here's the thing that might blow your mind. The Pinkerton Detective Agency wasn't something Rockstar made up for dramatic effect. These people were absolutely real, and they were exactly as terrifying as the game makes them seem. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was founded in 1850 by Alan Pinkerton, and by the time RDR2 takes place, they were basically the most powerful private law enforcement organization in America. Their motto was, "We never sleep," and they used an eye as their logo, which is where the term private eye actually comes from. These weren't just regular investigators. They were like a private army that corporations and the government could hire to handle problems that regular law enforcement couldn't or wouldn't deal with. During the Wild West era, the Pinkertons were the absolute nightmare of every outlaw gang. They had resources that local sheriffs could only dream of: unlimited funding, advanced technology for the time, and most importantly, they never gave up. When a railroad company or bank got tired of being robbed, they'd hire the Pinkertons, and suddenly these outlaws weren't just dealing with some local sheriff anymore. They were up against professional manhunters with national reach and deep pockets. The real Pinkertons went after all the famous gangs we talked about earlier. They pursued Jesse James for years, eventually cornering him so effectively that he had to live in hiding under fake names. They were involved in the investigations that led to the downfall of the Dalton gang, and they were absolutely relentless in their pursuit of Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. The pressure from Pinkerton agents was actually one of the main reasons why Butch and Sundance fled to South America. They knew the Pinkertons would never stop hunting them in the United States. What made the Pinkertons so effective and so feared was their methods. They didn't just wait for crimes to happen and then investigate. They were proactive. They'd infiltrate gangs with undercover agents. They'd use informants and bribes, and they'd coordinate with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. In a time when most police work was local and unorganized, the Pinkertons operated like a modern federal agency. They had files on criminals, they shared information between offices, and they used the telegraph system to coordinate operations across vast distances. The Pinkertons also had this reputation for being completely ruthless. They weren't bound by the same legal restrictions as regular law enforcement, which meant they could use methods that were questionable at best. They were involved in some seriously controversial stuff, including strike-breaking and labor disputes where they essentially acted as private military contractors for big corporations. This gave them this sinister reputation as the enforcers of corporate power against regular working people. In RDR 2, when Agent Milton and Agent Ross show up, they represent everything the Outlaws are fighting against: the cold, impersonal force of modernization and corporate power. They're not local sheriffs who might have some sympathy for the community or understanding of the circumstances. They're professional manhunters who see the gang as nothing more than a problem to be solved efficiently. That dynamic was absolutely real, and it's one of the reasons why the Pinkertons were so effective at bringing down outlaw gangs. The historical Pinkertons were so good at their job that they basically helped end the era of famous outlaw gangs. By the early 1900s, it became almost impossible for gangs to operate the way they had in the 1870s and 1880s. The combination of improved law enforcement, better communication technology, and organizations like the Pinkertons made the old-school outlaw lifestyle unsustainable. The Wild West wasn't just ended by civilization and progress in general. It was actively hunted to extinction by professional organizations that had the resources and determination to track down every last gang. This is why the Pinkertons work so well as antagonists in RDR 2. They're not just bad guys, they represent the inevitable end of the outlaw era. They're the personification of everything Dutch rails against in his speeches about civilization destroying freedom. The fact that they're based on a real organization that actually did hunt down and destroy real outlaw gangs just makes the whole story that much more powerful and tragic. That's all for today's video, but let me know in the comments what other connections you've noticed between RDR 2 and real Wild West history. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and I'll see you in the next video.